America's founding fathers are treated like flawless geniuses, but before they built a nation, they built inventions so dumb, weird, and overconfident that many of them failed instantly, and some nearly took their inventors down with them. This video breaks down 44 real inventions created by the founding fathers that completely backfired. 1. Thomas Jefferson built a great clock at Monticello that stands as a permanent, humiliating monument to his inability to use a simple tape measure. He designed the massive cannonball weights to descend for 7 full days, but he completely forgot to check if his wall was actually tall enough for the drop. Every single Friday, the heavy iron balls would smash into the floorboards with a loud thud, stopping the clock dead and ruining the mood right before the weekend. Instead of admitting he made a rookie math error and shortening the ropes, he ordered his carpenters to saw jagged, ugly holes right through his expensive hardwood floor. He literally mutilated his own mansion so the weights could plummet into the dark basement, proving he would rather destroy his house than admit he was wrong. 2. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration, invented a cure-all medicine called thunderclappers that was actually just chemical warfare for your intestines. He believed the human body needed to be completely emptied to be healthy, so he created these pills out of mercury and potent jalap root that acted as an explosive laxative. He gave them to everyone, including the explorers Lewis and Clark, who consumed them on their journey and left a literal trail of misery across the continent. These pills didn't cure a single disease, but they were so powerful that archaeologists today can actually track the explorers' campsites by finding the deposits of mercury in the soil where they frantically went to the bathroom. 3. Benjamin Franklin is supposed to be the smartest man in history, but he waged a completely idiotic war against the English alphabet because he was too lazy to write the letter C. In 1768, he decided that spelling was just too hard, so he invented a bizarre new phonetic system that replaced normal letters with 6 alien squiggles he drew himself. He started sending letters to his friends written in this chaotic gibberish, forcing them to decode his messages like they were solving a painful riddle just to hear him say hello. His peers basically ghosted him because reading his handwriting gave them a migraine, but he refused to stop. It was a massive ego trip where he tried to rewrite an entire language just because he personally found the letters J and Q to be offensive trash. 4. George Washington was so obsessed with poop that he actually designed and built a fancy architectural monument specifically for horse manure. He created a complex dung repository at Mount Vernon, a hexagonal building with specialized ventilation windows just to store compost perfectly. He spent hours calculating the exact geometry needed to rot fertilizer efficiently, treating a pile of waste like it was the crown jewels. It is hilarious to imagine the commander-in-chief standing proudly in front of a shed full of manure, lecturing his soldiers on the importance of premium fertilizer while they just tried not to breathe through their noses. 5. Decades before safety regulations existed, Benjamin Franklin turned a dinner party into a disaster because he was convinced that electricity was the secret to gourmet cooking. He developed a bizarre theory that zapping a turkey would make the meat uncommonly tender, so he rigged up a battery of glass jars to perform the culinary experiment. But during the demonstration, he got distracted by the crowd and accidentally took the full jolt himself instead of the bird. The shock was massive enough to leave him stunned, vibrating, and humiliated while the turkey sat there completely unharmed. He survived the embarrassment only to later admit that the electrocuted meat tasted absolutely terrible anyway. 6. Thomas Paine is famous for writing common sense, but he had absolutely no common sense when he decided to become a civil engineer and invent the iron bridge. He became obsessed with building a massive, single-span metal bridge and dragged a 13-foot model of it across the ocean to London like a madman. Since nobody wanted to buy his heavy metal monster, he paid to have the bridge constructed in a literal grassy field in Paddington where there was absolutely no water and no river to cross. He went into massive debt showing off a bridge that led to nowhere, standing in the middle of a meadow just to prove a point, while the rest of the world looked at him like he had lost his mind. 7. Benjamin Franklin invented a musical instrument called the glass harmonica that was basically a spinning nightmare of wet glass bowls. He thought the ethereal sound was heavenly, but everyone else was convinced the vibrations literally drove people insane. Listeners complained that the spooky screeching caused muscle spasms, internal bleeding, and nervous breakdowns, leading to a widespread panic that the instrument was cursed. He would play this thing at parties while his guests sat there in terror, covering their ears and praying they wouldn't lose their minds, proving that Franklin's mixtape was the absolute worst thing to drop in the 18th century. 8. David Bushnell tried to win the war by inventing the turtle, which was essentially a floating beer barrel that he convinced people was a submarine. It was a tiny tar-covered wooden sphere that held one very claustrophobic pilot who had to hand-crank a propeller while breathing limited air. The brilliant plan was to drift under a British ship and drill a hole into the hull to plant a bomb. But Bushnell forgot that British ships were plated with metal. The pilot spent hours frantically spinning his little drill against the copper plating, doing absolutely zero damage while bouncing around like a confused fish in a keg. He eventually gave up and drifted away, proving that fighting the Royal Navy with a wooden barrel and a hand drill is exactly as stupid as it sounds. 9. Charles Wilson. Peale was a famous patriot and painter who nearly cooked himself like a lobster in his own living room. He was obsessed with the health benefits of sweating, so he built a portable steam bath that looked like a vertical wooden coffin with a furnace attached. One day, he climbed inside to sweat out a cold, but the latch jammed tight, trapping him in the rising heat with no way to escape. He was literally boiling alive in a box he built himself and had to scream at the top of his lungs until his family smashed the contraption open with an axe. He wanted to revolutionize hygiene, but only succeeded in creating a terrifying human oven, proving that trying to relax can sometimes be a life-threatening activity. 10. George Washington is the father of the country, but he was also the father of a terrible farming invention called the barrel drill plow that was basically a rolling disaster. He designed a complex spinning wooden drum that was supposed to drop seeds into perfect rows automatically, but he essentially tried to build a precision robot out of logs and nails. In the fields, it was a clumsy nightmare that jammed constantly, clogged with wet mud, and dumped expensive seeds in useless piles while Washington yelled at it. He dragged this heavy, broken contraption around his estate for years, tinkering with it and cursing its mechanics. But he was too stubborn to go back to hand planting. It remains a hilarious example of a legendary general being defeated by the simple mechanics of a wooden box. 11. Elisha Perkins was a doctor who somehow scammed the smartest men in America with two literal pieces of junk metal he called tractors. He claimed these small brass and iron rods could pull pain out of the body just by rubbing them on your skin, which is obviously total nonsense. He actually convinced George Washington to buy a set for his family, proving that you can win a revolution but still fall for a cheap carnival trick. Perkins became rich selling these magic wands until scientists revealed they were just painted nails that did absolutely nothing. It is hilarious to think of the founding fathers sitting around rubbing metal sticks on their sore backs, convinced they were using high technology when they were just playing with expensive scrap metal. 12. Thomas Jefferson was so antisocial that he installed dumbwaiters in his dining room specifically so he wouldn't have to talk to his own servants. These were small, hidden elevators built into the fireplace mantel that allowed wine bottles to magically pop up from the cellar without a human entering the room. He literally engineered a complex system of pulleys and weights just to avoid making small talk with the waiter while he was eating. It was the 18th century equivalent of using a machine to do the job because you can't handle human interaction, proving that even extroverted politicians sometimes just want to drink alone without being judged. 13. Francis Hopkinson signed the Declaration of Independence, but he probably should have been banned from touching musical instruments. He hated the tiny clicking sound that harpsichord quills made when plucking strings, so he decided to fix it by reinventing the entire mechanism with metal and leather tips. Instead of making the sound pure, his tinkering caused the instrument to get oily and gummed up, turning beautiful music into a muffled, greasy mess. He spent months ruining perfectly good expensive instruments to fix a background noise that literally nobody else cared about, proving that just because you are a founding father doesn't mean you are qualified to perform surgery on a piano. 14. Robert R. Livingston helped draft the Declaration of Independence, but his engineering skills were a total declaration of incompetence. Before he got famous, he tried to invent a steamboat with a design that defied all logic. Instead of putting wheels on the sides like a sane person, he installed a massive horizontal wooden propeller directly underneath the hull. He essentially turned his boat into a giant floating blender that churned the water into foam without actually pushing the vessel forward. The vibration was so violent that the boat threatened to shake itself into splinters, terrifying the crew who thought they were riding a steam-powered earthquake. He burned through a fortune creating a ship that was excellent at making river milkshakes but terrible at moving. 15. Benjamin Franklin was the king of laziness, which is why he invented the fan chair to avoid the exhausting task of moving his own hand. He attached a foot pedal to his rocking chair that was connected to a large overhead fan, allowing him to cool his face by furiously pumping his leg like he was riding a bicycle. While it did create a breeze, the physical exertion of stomping the pedal actually made him hotter and sweatier than if he had just sat still. He turned relaxing into a cardio workout, looking like a sweaty, rocking maniac just to avoid picking up a simple hand fan. 16. Christopher Cowles decided to fix New York City's water problem by burying thousands of hollow wooden logs under the streets to act as pipes. He built a massive, clumsy steam engine to pump water through these tree trunks, but the machine was so weak it could barely push water uphill. The wooden pipes immediately started to rot and leak, turning the city's water supply into a disgusting, swampy sludge that tasted like old bark and mud. He spent all the city's money on this rotting underground disaster and eventually had to flee town when angry mobs realized they were drinking expensive dirt water. It was a civil engineering project that proved wood is a terrible choice for plumbing unless you enjoy the taste of a decomposing forest. 17. Levi Hutchins invented the very first American alarm clock in 1787, but it was practically a prank because the device had absolutely no buttons to change the time. The machine was hardwired to ring violently at exactly 4 in the morning every single day because that was when Levi liked to wake up, and he assumed everyone else should suffer with him. If you wanted to sleep until 6, too bad, because this wooden box was going to scream at you in the pitch blackness whether you liked it or not. It was a groundbreaking invention that solved the problem of oversleeping by ensuring that its owner would never enjoy a peaceful morning again, proving that early inventors didn't care about user experience at all. 18. Count Rumford was a brilliant scientist who decided that making coffee was too easy, so he invented a drip pot that turned breakfast into a test of patience. He designed a complex cylinder that packed the coffee grounds so tightly that the water took an eternity to trickle through, meaning you had to wait 20 minutes for a single cup of lukewarm sludge. He wrote arrogant essays bragging about how this method preserved the essential oils, but in reality, he just created the world's most annoying brewing method. He turned the simple joy of morning caffeine into a boring science experiment that made his guests want to smash the pot and just chew the beans instead. 19. James Rumsey was an engineer backed by George Washington who invented a boat that literally tried to walk on the river bottom. Instead of using a normal paddle wheel, Rumsey designed a bizarre system of mechanical wooden poles that reached down and stomped the mud to push the boat forward. It looked like a giant, clumsy water spider jerking its way upstream and was incredibly uncomfortable for everyone on board. The mechanical legs constantly got stuck in the muck or snapped off under the pressure, making the walking boat one of the most hilariously inefficient ways to travel unless you enjoyed moving at the speed of a tired snail while the engine screamed at you. 20. Samuel Morey decided that steam engines were too safe, so he invented a boat motor that ran on a volatile mixture of turpentine and alcohol. He piloted this floating bomb up the Connecticut River, sitting on top of a tank of explosive paint thinner that banged and popped loud enough to scare every farmer in the valley. The engine actually worked, but the fumes were so toxic and the risk of exploding into a fireball was so high that nobody wanted to buy a ticket. He basically invented the internal combustion engine decades ahead of time, but he used the worst possible fuel, proving that innovation doesn't matter if your invention smells like a chemical spill and might kill everyone aboard. 21. Thomas Jefferson was the original annoying foodie. and he tried to force America to love pasta by inventing his own macaroni machine. He sent secret agents to Italy to steal diagrams and built a clumsy wooden press in Virginia to squeeze out dough noodles. The machine was a mechanical failure that constantly jammed and produced thick, gummy paste that nobody wanted to eat. He insisted on serving this unappetizing macaroni pie at state dinners to confused guests who just wanted a normal steak, proving that being president doesn't mean you should try to run an Italian restaurant from your basement. 22. John Greenwood served as George Washington's personal dentist, and he invented a foot engine drill that turned a checkup into a torture session. Before electricity, he built a spinning drill bit powered by a foot pedal, exactly like an old sewing machine, but for your teeth. The dentist had to furiously stomp on the pedal to get the drill spinning fast enough to grind away enamel, creating a vibrating, wobbling nightmare in the patient's mouth. It was a terrifying multitasking fail where, if the dentist got tired legs, the drill would slow down and get stuck in your molar, proving that some things should definitely not be powered by cardio. 23. Philip Singh was the silversmith who created the inkstand for the Declaration of Independence, but he also tried to invent a leak-proof traveling inkwell that was a total pocket disaster. He designed a complex system of screws and springs to seal the ink inside a silver chamber, thinking he had solved the problem of writing on the road. In reality, the pressure would build up inside the metal casing, and when you opened it to write a letter, it would often sneeze a splash of black ink all over your shirt. He basically invented an expensive ink grenade that ruined more coats than it wrote letters, showing that carrying liquid in your pocket is always a risky gamble. 24. David Rittenhouse was a famous astronomer who turned his own house into a creepy bug farm because he decided normal thread was too thick for his telescope sights. He hunted local spiders and kept them in boxes, harvesting their silk to create crosshairs for his instruments because he wanted absolute perfection. He bragged about his bug tech, but he ignored the fact that spider silk is sticky, fragile, and reacts to humidity by sagging. He was a grown man running a spider plantation to fix a problem that didn't really exist, creating delicate instruments that would break if you breathed on them too hard, all while his neighbors wondered why his house was full of cobwebs. 25. Ebenezer Kinnersley was a close friend of Franklin who tried to invent an electrical air thermometer because he didn't understand how heat worked. He believed that electricity was a hot fluid, so he built a glass gadget to measure the temperature of a lightning bolt or a static shock. He spent hours zapping this glass tube, expecting the air inside to expand from the electric heat. But nothing happened because that is not physics works. He essentially built a fancy glass tube to measure a phenomenon that didn't exist, proving that you can be best friends with a genius and still have absolutely no clue what you are doing in the lab. 26. As a young inventor, Benjamin Franklin looked more like a confused wooden monster flailing in the water than a future statesman. He decided to revolutionize swimming by carving hard, rigid wooden pallets to strap onto his hands and feet, convinced he could zoom through the water like a shark. While the aerodynamics technically worked to pull him forward, the heavy timber put such excruciating leverage on his wrists and ankles that he was in agony after just a few minutes. Instead of gliding gracefully, he ended up with crushed joints and massive cramps, dragging these heavy boards through the water like a drowning prisoner. He quickly threw the wood away, realizing that turning your limbs into stiff paddles is a great way to sink. 27. Robert Morris was the financial genius who paid for the revolution, but he went personally bankrupt trying to conquer the simple concept of ice. He desperately wanted to enjoy cold drinks in the Philadelphia summer, so he hired an architect to dig a massive cavernous pit in his garden to store winter ice. The problem was that he completely ignored the concept of drainage or insulation, essentially just burying a giant ice cube in warm dirt. Within weeks, his expensive luxury freezer turned into a disgusting, muddy swimming pool of lukewarm slush. He spent a fortune trying to defy the seasons, only to prove that money cannot buy you a cold drink if you don't understand how melting works. 28. John Isaac Hawkins was an inventor who decided that writing one letter at a time was for losers, so he created the polygraph, which was not a lie detector but a nightmare duplicating machine. It was a spindly wooden skeleton with two pens connected by wires. So when you wrote with one, the other mechanical arm would jerk around and copy you. It sounded like a great idea until you realized the machine was fragile, squeaky, and constantly jammed, leaving the copy looking like it was written by a drunk ghost. Thomas Jefferson loved this thing and bought several, mostly ignoring the fact that the second pen would often wander off the page and draw on the table, proving that multitasking is usually a bad idea. 29. Noah Webster is famous for his dictionary, but he also tried to save the world with a fireproof paint that was actually just a recipe for a smelly house. He was terrified of fires, so he invented a mixture of lime, skim milk, and salt that he claimed would make wood impossible to burn. He painted his friends' houses with this dairy-based sludge, convinced it was a shield against flames. While it didn't catch fire easily, it also had the unfortunate side effect of washing away in the rain and making the entire building smell like spoiling milk in the summer sun. He proved that you can indeed protect a house from fire, but only by making it smell so bad that nobody wants to live in it anyway. 30. Cadwallader Colden was a brilliant colonial governor who tried to revolutionize printing by inventing stereotyping way before the technology was ready. His idea was to fuse thousands of tiny metal letters into one solid, massive block of lead for every single page of a book. He didn't realize that this would make printing a book require literal tons of metal that were impossible to move or store without crushing the floor. He sent his heavy, toxic lead plates to Europe, where printers laughed at the idea of storing a library that weighed as much as a battleship. He tried to fix a printing process that wasn't broken, and ended up creating the heaviest, most inconvenient documents in human history. 31. James Madison was the smallest president, but he tried to compensate with a microscope walking stick that made him look like a wandering lunatic. He loved nature, so he had a cane designed with a built-in magnifying glass and specimen holder so he could inspect bugs on his walks. The problem was that to use it, he had to stop, crouch down in the dirt, and fiddle with a lens attached to a stick, holding up everyone walking with him. He looked less like a dignified statesman and more like a confused man poking at the ground because he lost his glasses. It was the 18th century equivalent of doom scrolling while walking on the sidewalk, annoying everyone around you. 32. Thomas Jefferson was obsessed with applying calculus to farming, so he spent years designing the moldboard of least resistance, a plow blade shaped by complex mathematical formulas. He believed that if the curve was geometrically perfect, it would slice through the earth like butter. However, he forgot that dirt doesn't care about math, and local farmers absolutely hated the thing because it was impossible to manufacture and awkward to steer. He essentially tried to bring a scientific calculator to a mud fight, creating a tool that was theoretically perfect on paper, but practically useless for anyone who actually had to work for a living. 33. John Fitch built one of the first steamboats in America, but he designed it to look like a mechanical nightmare from a horror movie. Instead of a rotating wheel, he attached a rack of 6 massive upright paddles to each side that moved in a sequence like galloping horse legs. It looked like a gigantic, steam-powered centipede thrashing wildly through the water, and the sight of it actually terrified people standing on the riverbanks. The boat vibrated so violently that passengers felt like their teeth were rattling loose, proving that just because you can make a boat row itself doesn't mean it won't look absolutely ridiculous and scare every fisherman in Philadelphia. 34. George Washington built a 16-sided barn that stands as a monument to overthinking a simple problem. He wanted an efficient way to thresh wheat, so he designed a 2-story polygon where horses would run in endless circles on the top floor, stomping the grain through gaps in the floorboards. While it worked, the complex shape was a nightmare to build and prone to leaking, and the poor horses got dizzy running in tight geometric loops all day. He essentially built a horse-powered treadmill in the shape of a stop sign, proving that sometimes a simple square barn is popular for a reason. 35. Benjamin Rush is known as the father of American psychiatry, but his invention called the tranquilizing chair was a bizarre medical nightmare. He believed that mental illness was caused by too much blood in the brain, so he strapped patients into a chair with a bucket over their head and clamps on their limbs to restrict movement for hours. He thought immobilizing people would calm their pulse. But unsurprisingly, being tied to a wooden throne with a box on your head only made people more terrified and agitated. It was therapy, designed by someone who clearly had no idea how human emotions work, turning a doctor's visit into a stress test. 36. Thomas Paine, the voice of the revolution, tried to revolutionize lighting with a smokeless candle. That was a total chemistry fail. He grew tired of candles smelling bad and smoking up the room, so he designed a special lamp case to control the airflow and burn the wax more purely. The problem was that his design trapped so much heat that the candle didn't just burn. It melted instantly into a puddle of hot wax, often threatening to set the table on fire. He tried to solve the minor annoyance of smoke by creating a device that was essentially a ticking time bomb of molten grease. 37. Elbridge Gerry isn't an inventor in the mechanical sense, but he invented the most corrupt political tool in history, the gerrymander. As governor, he redrew the map of voting districts in Massachusetts into such a ridiculous, twisted shape to help his party win that it looked like a mythological salamander. He looked at a map of real human communities and decided to slice them up like a distorted jigsaw puzzle just to steal an election. It was an invention of pure selfishness that didn't make government better, but it definitely proved that politicians will bend reality itself just to keep their jobs. 38. Eli Whitney is famous for the cotton gin, but he became a scam artist with his interchangeable musket factory. He promised the government he could build 10,000 guns in 2 years using machine-made parts that were identical, a revolutionary concept at the time. In reality, he didn't have the technology to do it, so he spent 10 years faking it and barely delivering any guns. When he finally did a demonstration, he likely hand-filed the parts to fit perfectly just to trick the inspectors. He basically invented the concept of fake it till you make it on a federal level, taking taxpayer money for a factory that was mostly just smoke and mirrors. 39. Baron von Steuben was a military genius who had to invent the concept of the latrine for American soldiers because they were disgusting. When he arrived at Valley Forge, he found that soldiers were relieving themselves literally anywhere, including right next to the kitchens where food was cooked. He had to draw diagrams and scream at grown men to explain that poop and soup should be kept in separate locations. It wasn't a mechanical invention, but his system of hygiene was a desperate innovation to stop the army from killing itself with its own filth, proving that the founding fathers needed a German guy to teach them how to use a bathroom. 40. Oliver Evans invented a mechanical monster called the Oryctor Amphibolos, which was a steam-powered boat that tried to drive on land. It was a 30-foot-long, 17-ton dredging barge that he put wheels on, creating a terrifying amphibian vehicle that crawled through the streets of Philadelphia. It moved slower than a walking person and made a deafening noise that scared every horse within a mile, shaking the ground as it rolled toward the river. He wanted to show off the power of steam, but mostly he just created a giant groaning traffic jam that looked like a confused whale trying to learn how to walk. It was the first automobile in America, and it was a complete heavy embarrassment. 41. John Stevens was a wealthy colonel who built a steam locomotive in his own backyard because nobody else wanted one. Since there were no railroad tracks in America yet, he constructed a small circular track on his lawn and drove his noisy steam carriage around in circles for hours. He looked like a madman spinning on a giant toy train, while his neighbors watched in total confusion from over the fence. The engine blew smoke everywhere and achieved a top speed of 12 miles per hour, which felt terrifyingly fast to him but looked ridiculous to everyone else. He proved steam travel was possible, but he mostly just proved that he was a rich guy with a very loud, expensive hobby that went absolutely nowhere. 42. William Thornton was the architect who designed the U.S. Capitol, but he also had the incredibly stupid idea to build a cannon powered by steam instead of gunpowder. He believed he could shoot bullets by attaching a high-pressure boiler to a gun barrel, creating a weapon that required a literal fire and a pot of boiling water to operate. It was a heavy, leaking metal nightmare that would have been impossible to drag through the mud of a battlefield without scalding the soldiers to death. He tried to sell this hissing tea kettle of doom to the military, ignoring the obvious fact that gunpowder is popular because you don't have to wait for water to boil before you can shoot back. 43. Robert Fulton is famous for steamboats, but before that, he tried to sell a submarine to Napoleon that was basically an underwater coffin. He named it the Nautilus and sat inside this tiny metal tube, waiting for British ships to sail by so he could attach a bomb. The problem was that the submarine was incredibly slow and the British ships were fast, so he spent weeks just sitting underwater in the dark, smelling his own sweat and catching absolutely nothing. He eventually ran out of air and patience, surfacing to tell everyone that naval warfare is really boring when you are stuck in a tin can that cannot catch its target. He wasted a fortune proving that being a human buoy is a terrible military strategy. 44. To wrap up this list of questionable genius, Benjamin Franklin owned and proudly displayed a purse made entirely of asbestos. He was fascinated by the miracle material because it wouldn't burn in a fire, so he carried his money around in a bag made of literal carcinogens. He would show it off to friends, tossing it into the fireplace to prove how cool it was, completely unaware that he was playing with a toxic death trap. It is the perfect final example of how the Founding Fathers were brilliant enough to build a country but dumb enough to carry their loose change in a pouch made of cancer. After everything you just saw, here's the real question. If these same men were alive today, would you trust them to design your phone, your car, or your government systems? Pick one Founding Father from this video and name the modern invention you would never let them touch. Be specific. If this video changed how you see American history, hit like. If you enjoy history without worship and without boredom, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly that.